This is a horse skull that I bought online because what can't you buy on the internet?
This Christmas, I'm creating a sculpture based on Mari Lwyd, a 19th century Welsh tradition in which a group carrying a hooded horse skull on a stick, adorned with ribbons and glass eyes, comes knocking on doors, singing a tune demanding entry into your home. Except, my skull will be made of clay, and I'm making it a unicorn. It might also end up as my Christmas tree, since the air purifier isn't very decorative. Let's get into it. So this skull came from a wild horse. It was ethically sourced from an individual who was born and raised on a Native American reservation in Washington. It has been outside for a little while, but still has some fleshiness to it. So before I do anything strange with this, I'm gonna need to do a little cleanup first. I'm gonna start first by showing you a trick on material conservation, since I'm gonna need a lot of peroxide. A large bottle of 12% hydrogen peroxide is poured inside of the bag with the skull. The strength of the peroxide means it can be watered down to get more for less. Then I fill up the bin so that the water pressure can push the peroxide in the bag up and around the skull. It doesn't take long for the peroxide to start kicking in, so I'll tie up the bag and let this thing fester for a little bit and check on it tomorrow.
Well, I don't really see this thing fizzing anymore, but I definitely need some gloves. No, they simply will not do. Oh, perfect. Blech. We must have destroyed some plaque because we've got a loose tooth here, but we'll do a little dental work and finish cleaning this thing up and we're ready for casting.
I'm going to be making a clay mold for this project so that I can preserve the skull. This is the exact same process that I used last year with a deer skull to make a zombie Rudolph. So if you haven't seen that video yet, check it out. Clay molding probably isn't the ideal technique for a larger specimen, but the horse skull is relatively simple, and I'd like to think that I've gotten pretty good at doing this. If you haven't noticed from my channel already, ceramic clay is my preferred medium for making most things. And although this can be a tricky process, it still beats working with plaster or silicone or any of that stuff. With sufficient time to dry, I have to cut the mold off in as few pieces as possible. I was determined to get the bottom off in one piece, but as you can see, that didn't really work out. Fortunately, when the parts are cut in half, at least they can be pieced back together and patched up pretty easily. Now I'm in a bit of a time crunch with this piece, so I'm trying to expedite the drying with a hairdryer. It can be dangerous business trying to fire even a slightly wet piece inside of a kiln, but I'll just slap a good long preheat on this thing and hope for the best for its survival.
Well, that's not good. But it could have been a lot worse. My guess is just that with trying to rush the drying, it just didn't agree with the process and split along where I'd cut it and pulled it off of the skull and where it had originally broke while I was doing that, but it's what you get for trying to rush things in ceramics.
I'm going to patch this up with some epoxy sculpt. You know, the most ironic thing about trying to rush the drying was that I wanted to save myself a day, and now I've essentially put myself a day behind with a more inferior mold. But at any rate, let's go ahead and commence with casting. Trying to get this thing apart was a real pain, and I ended up making a big mistake in the process.
Of course I would.
So the first cast obviously didn't go too well, and I think a big part of that was because I missed a pretty major undercut here near the nose that trapped clay inside. Even casting without putting the mold parts together, you can see that I still have to cut the nose off where the undercut is, which is no problem, it can be easily patched. Luckily for me, the bottom came out pretty easily. One of the trickiest parts is dealing with the negative space in the nose and the eye sockets. I'll do my best to use what clay is already there, but I will have to do some refining and create a tunnel-like structure that still provides the illusion of staring into the void. The eye sockets are going to be slightly more complex since there's a lot going on there. The plan I've devised is to strategically cut and fold down the two negative spaces so that they almost meet. From there, I'll cut out a perfectly shaped slab to bridge the gap and smooth it together for a beautiful transition. Then I'll add one more tunnel structure to bridge the two sides. With that out of the way, now we can get to the easy stuff. Or at least putting two halves together should be easy in theory, but the disadvantage with casting separate parts like this is the drying discrepancies and the warping that can occur because of it. Since the roof of the mouth and teeth are causing the main problem here, I'll just cut that off and put it back on later. I told myself that with being on a time crunch, I'd try to keep this one simple, but I can't go against my nature. It's time for detailing. It survived the firing. Now let's paint it. The finishing for this one is about the same as I do with most of my pieces. I'm starting out with a thin, dark wash across the entire sculpture, which will find its way into all the nooks and crannies. Then I'm applying a bronze acrylic layer and wiping it back with a sponge for a warm, rusty base color. With the intention of that earthiness showing through, I can now sponge on some off-white to give it that convincing bone finish. For the eyes, I'm going to add in different tones of red and orange for the iris, and of course the pupils will be black, which I will also add back to the iris for added dimension. But the real cherry on top is this simple white reflection. With all that done, let's get this home for installation. The sculpture is mounted on a large wooden dowel and a live tree stand. Some formed chicken wire is added to bulk up the cloak that Katie fabricated with her sewing skills. She also used her aesthetic eye with various greenery, ribbons, and trinkets for the ornamental crown. The final touch is to add the eyes with a little bit of hot glue, that way I can decide to display with or without them in the future. Now, let's see it in all of its glory.